To build a composition, a composer is going to probably start off with the melody, again, the main idea. But if that particular composer's goal is to compose a symphony, to compose a piece for a choral ensemble, then he's not going to stop there. He's going to add other lines of music for other parts, for other instruments, for other voices. Since I have a strong vocal background, if you're building a choral composition, then you're probably looking at building a line for the sopranos, the altos, the tenors, and the basses. The soprano part primarily typically sings the melody. Sometimes the melody is passed to another part, but for this case, let's use the sopranos as the melody. Then you're going to have three other sections where you're writing a piece of music for them to go along with the melody. And all of those lines are going to need to harmonize. So as you put together your melody on your piece of paper, you probably have determined a particular scale that you're going to use. And so that then gives you the idea of the scheme of how the chords and everything is going to play out. Harmony is built when you have several notes sounding together, at least two or more. So typically in a choral situation, you might have 3 or 4 different notes sounding at any given time. Let's remember our definition for melody: a succession of single pitches perceived by the mind as a whole. You're building this horizontal line effect. But now with harmony, you're building vertical lines. These vertical lines forming chords and adding a lot of richness, a lot of depth to the existing melody. Now, thinking back to my days in undergrad and graduate school, I really don't recall a class talking a lot about harmony. Instead, we talked a lot about this word, tonality. Tonality is when you're looking at a composition and you're trying to figure out what particular note, what particular pitch the entire composition revolves around. So we look at a piece of music. If we had My Country 'Tis of Thee in front of us, we could look at the piece and see, okay, well, it uses one flat, and we realize that it's using a major key. There's only one scale that uses, one major scale that has only one flat to it. So we would know that it uses typically F major. Well, F being the name of the scale, F then becomes the tonality of the piece, the tonal center. So that brings us to this term scale. Remember when I said just a few moments ago that 8 was a significant number in music? Well, it is. A scale is a community of 8 notes, and if you think about your alphabet song that you learned in kindergarten, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, we use A through G as letter names for pitches. A through G is only 7 though. So in a community of 8, that means that a scale is going to take one of those notes and it's going to be repeated. If we think about F major as the scale that we use for My Country 'Tis of Thee, then we start with F. So we have F, G, then we rotate back to A, F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, and that brings us back to F. So F is the first and F is the last note of the scale. What I want to do is spend a little bit of time with you with describing a scale. So please really pay attention to your PowerPoint here. There are 4 different ways to describe the scale. The first is by the letter names. The scale example that I have for you on your PowerPoint is the C major scale. Now, my mother was the organist at my church that I grew up in, so I was going to have to take piano lessons at some point. And so when I reached 3rd grade, I started playing piano. And it was not a very good existence for me. I had a great right hand when playing the piano, but my left hand just couldn't keep the pace. So after struggling for several lessons, I'm sure, I finally was able to play the C major scale. So the C major scale, if you think about it in terms of its letter names, then it's C, D, E, F, G, rotate again back to the beginning, A, B, C. You start with the C major scale because it doesn't have any sharps, it doesn't have any flats, and so it doesn't have any accidentals, we call it. So that's where we begin. If you are in a high school situation where you're in a choir, then that choir might go off to sing at festivals. When I was in choir in high school, we would learn 2 or 3 songs, and we would learn them well enough to be able to perform them from memory, and we would go and sing those in front of a couple of judges. But that wasn't the end of the day. We would then be ushered into usually a very poor acoustic situation, usually the cafeteria of the high school that we're visiting, and we would sing together scales. Now in my high school, we sang scales using numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. So we start with 1 and we end with 1. Remember, we begin and end on the same pitch name. However, if we were in Europe, then we wouldn't use numbers. We would use the solfeggio system. Solfeggio is an Italian word. We're going to learn several Italian words this semester. That means scale. And thanks to The Sound of Music and Rodgers and Hammerstein, we know this wonderful little song that helps us to remember do a deer, a female deer, re a golden drop of sun. Well, the solfeggio system is do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and that brings us back to do. So C to C, 1 to 1, do to do. You see how all of this is faring out. And then I also would like for you to know that there are theoretical names for the different scale degrees. I don't want you to know every one of them, but there are 3 that are a little bit more important than the others, because when you build a chord or you build a harmony on these 3 pitches, you get a major sound. And that's very important in terms of when a composer is putting together his composition. That helps you keep pulling back to your tonal center. So obviously the most important scale degree is the 1, or the do. It happens twice. It's called the tonic, hence tonality. So the tonic of the C major scale is C. The 5th note of the scale is called the dominant. So in this case, it's G. And then the 3rd most important scale degree is called the subdominant, or the 4th scale degree. In this case, it's F. But please do not equate do or the tonic with C. This is just the example of the scale that I'm using. Now go to your next slide, and here you find the G major scale. G now becomes the tonic. It's the do, it's the 1. The dominant, the 5th scale degree, is your so, a needle pulling thread. In this case, it's the D. And then your subdominant is the 4th scale degree. And now that C, where it was the tonic before, it's moved. C is moved. So don't put do and 1 and the tonic with C, because all that's going to be moving. The solfeggio system, though, is always the same. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, regardless of which scale that you're using. The T, a drink with jam and bread, in this particular scale is F sharp. If I ask you on a test which note in this scale is the T and you only tell me F, then that would be incorrect, because F natural is different from F flat and is different from F sharp. When you add a sharp to a note, you raise it by a half step. When you add a flat to it, you lower it by a half step. So in this particular scale, we need F sharp to complete the major sound that it makes. So F sharp would be your answer if I asked you which note was the T or which note was the 7. I want you to go online and find the segment from the movie The Sound of Music and watch the do, re, mi sequence. This is a very, very important scene because it kind of culminates what we've been talking about this morning. She teaches the children about how to sing. And so she finds out that they don't really know anything about music. So she says, let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. So she teaches them a scale. using the solfeggio system. And then she starts to mix the notes around to build a melody. Then one of the little girls says, but it doesn't mean anything. So then she puts a text to it. And so we now have a melody with a text. Then watch for the segment where she's in the carriage with all the children and she's pointing at them. And so they're singing a note and she's singing the melody above them. She's adding the harmony and building a complete song. What's great about The Sound of Music is that there's 7 Von Trapp children. With the addition of Maria, now we have 8 different people, each one that can carry one of the different notes in a scale. So I want you to pay attention to that and watch that. Just a couple more definitions to share with you under harmony. And that would be major versus minor. A major sound is something that's bright. It's happy. I can remember my elementary school music director playing for us a major chord and saying, major is happy. And then they lowered that third in the chord and they said, but minor is sad. I can remember that to this day. So a minor sound is something that is sad, something that has a melancholy feel to it. And there are major scales and then there are corresponding minor scales, and all that comes about within the Baroque period, and we'll talk about that later on in the class. But for something that I do want you to kind of watch out for are these final 2 terms, consonance and dissonance. Consonance is when you have a sounding together of notes that are very stable. They're not very shocking at all. Dissonance is when you have a note sounding together that's full of tension, that's very clashing. For our ears today, and I'm taping this in 2015, we're used to hearing all kinds of sounds and all kinds of dissonant feels. But if you turn back the clock to the days of the medieval and Renaissance and Baroque periods, then they were not used to hearing all the different sounds that we are today. There was no jazz music and things of that nature that combine sometimes 7 and 8 and 9 different tones together. So they wanted their music to be consonant, to be very pleasing to the ear. And all of these composers were under the patronage system. So they were composing music for a duke, for a king, for a church. And so there was always a big brother looking over their shoulder. And so the majority of the music that we're going to be listening to for the beginning of the class is going to be very consonant. But when the patronage system crumbled, the world was going through a depression, a recession. At that particular time, there was a very important composer who was alive, and his name is Ludwig van Beethoven. And Beethoven is sometimes called the first modern artist, the first artist that was not worried about a patron telling him what to do. And so he started to dabble with a lot of different harmonies, a lot of different tone clusters. And so he started using dissonance as a functional part of his harmony. And that's one of the reasons why Beethoven is such a big deal in the field of classical music. He opened the floodgates for a lot of different sounds and ideas that would come out later in the Romantic and the 20th century. So that's kind of the turning point for the semester, where we're going to start hearing more dissonance in music. But for the first part, we're going to be very consonant, hearing music that's very pleasing. This concludes our first session. When next we meet, we're going to be talking about rhythm, and then we're going to go on to some of the other areas of the materials of music. Hope you have a great day.